Okay, so what is VNC? VNC, or Virtual Network Computing, is an app that allows a user to remotely access and control another computer system. VNC consists of two parts, the VNC Client and the VNC Server. The VNC Client runs on our local workstation, whereas the VNC Server runs on the remote Raspberry Pi. Conveniently, VNC Server is already loaded on our Raspberry Pi, but it does need to be configured. This video will show you how to configure VNC on both your Raspberry Pi and your local computer system. Ultimately, our goal is to run the Raspberry Pi in a headless configuration, namely without a monitor, keyboard, or mouse. So at this point, our Raspberry Pi currently has a monitor connected to its HDMI 0 port, a keyboard connected to its USB, a mouse connected to its USB, and power connected to the power input. And your Raspberry Pi is powered up. So here we are with our Raspberry Pi powered up. And the first thing that I want to do is I just want to verify that our wireless connection to our home network is running properly. And I'm going to go up into the upper left-hand corner over here, and I'm going to click on our terminal icon here along the upper toolbar. And we'll just double-click that, give it a moment to start up. Oh, and here it is. I actually opened it twice. And I'm going to type in the command ifconfig. For those of you who are familiar with ipconfig in the Windows environment, it's if in an Apple environment, Linux environment, and our Raspberry Pi. Remember that Raspbian, or the Raspberry OS, is a version of Linux. Okay, so ifconfig. And you'll notice that we have a couple of devices here, okay? We've got our Ethernet port identified as ETH0, and then down below we have WLAN0, and this is our wireless LAN configuration. You won't see any kind of IP address associated with the Ethernet connection simply because we do not have an Ethernet cable plugged into our Raspberry Pi. But down below with the wireless connection, you'll notice that we do have an IP address. We've got a subnet mask, okay? And you'll notice that the broadcast address is also given as 1.255. And another important thing is that we also get a MAC address. I encourage you to write down all three pieces: the IP address, your subnet mask, and your MAC address. When we get into the lab, the MAC address will be very helpful to know. Sometimes what I do is I create a little label and I put it on the back of my Raspberry Pi case, or I will just write it in my notes somewhere. So we can now see that our Raspberry Pi is connected to the wireless network, and it has an IP address which has been given out by the network router, and also assigned it has a MAC address, which will always be the same for this Raspberry Pi. The IP address may change depending upon what DHCP does, okay? So just be aware that IP addresses can change, but your MAC address should stay the same, okay? It is possible to change MAC addresses in other places, but you know, for our discussions, it's not going to change here, okay? So let's close this window. We're finished with this. Now we're going to go up to the Raspberry Pi icon, click on that, come on down to Preferences, and then we're going to go to Raspberry Pi Configuration. And in here, you have the opportunity to actually change the password on your Raspberry Pi, change its host name as well. And then we want to boot to the desktop. And you can also enable the splash screen if it's not already done so. Interfaces. There are a number of interfaces that we want to set up here. But just to show you, we have a camera interface. So if you do hook up a camera to your system on the camera interface, we do want to enable that. We also want to enable SSH and VNC. We're setting up VNC right now, so that's something that we want to do. SSH is something we'll talk about a little later, but while we're here, why don't we just turn that on? We'll also turn on a bus called the I2C bus, and we'll be using that in various projects through the semester. So we're going to enable that as well. And then finally, we'll also turn on the one wire. And this gives us access to our GPIOs, okay? Moving on, we're not going to do anything with performance, just leave everything with standard settings. Localization, if you need to change, for instance, the locale, I've got mine set to English. Country is United States. And we'll say okay to that. Time zone, I've got America, New York, we're East Coast. Keyboard, we're set to a US keyboard. Say okay to that. And Wi-Fi country, you're not going to change that. That's set to US. All right. And we'll simply say okay. Now at this point, it's recommended that in order for these changes to take effect, you must reboot at this point. And I'm going to say no, but I want you to say yes. You need to reboot. And the reason for that is we are actually, I'm currently running my Raspberry Pi using VNC. So I'm not going to, I don't need to reboot. I don't need to reinstall VNC. Mine is actually already configured, but you need to reboot your computer in order to get VNC. Now, the way we tell whether or not VNC is running is very easy. Over here in the upper right corner, there's an icon, VNC. And if we click on that, it basically tells us the IP address that we're presently using, along with a couple of other pieces of information, okay? Which is just fine. So we've confirmed that VNC server is running on our Raspberry Pi. We can also notice that we've got the wireless connection up here, and you can see that it is associated with my wireless network at home, and so we are good to go. The next piece that we're going to work on is configuring the VNC client on your laptop or workstation. Okay, next I opened up my browser and I put in Vnc Viewer for the search engine, and you can see that I have download Vnc Viewer. I'm going to just go to Windows, but you'll see that you can select anything from here. Click on that, and you'll notice the various operating systems that we can run Vnc Viewer on, or Vnc Server. And I've selected Windows because I'm loading this onto my Windows laptop. And you can specify, what you're looking for, what version. I want an EXE for x86 or x64, 64-bit. And I'm going to click on download. It will then download the file. So I'll say save. Okay, and that's complete. So let's open that up. And I've got prompts on my other screen here. So it's asking me what language do I want? I want English. I'll say okay. And again, pull this over here. We'll be installing Vnc Viewer 621.1109, and we'll say next. And we're just going to take the defaults and just keep saying next. Say install. And I've got a user access control here. I don't know if this will come up on the video, but I'll say yes. Here we go. And then we'll say finish. And let's see what we got here. So it wants to restart our system, and I'm going to say no for the moment. And okay, I've restarted my laptop, and I've started my Vnc Viewer. Now you'll notice that I already have a computer connection here to another Raspberry Pi that runs my TV up in the family room. And then I also have it Vnc hooked up to an old computer laptop in my office here, and it's basically set up off to the side, and this way I don't have to get up to use it. I can just attach to it here. So we need to set up a new computer for Vnc, a new remote computer that's running a server, and that's our Raspberry Pi. And so we'll go right click and we'll go to new connection. And then we're going to give it a name, and I'm just going to call it RPI. Sorry, that's the IP address I need to put in here. 192, if you remember, I asked you to write down your IP address, 192.168.1.100, which is mine. Then friendly name RPI. Okay, let's see. And we'll leave everything else alone. Say okay. And here it is right here. Now we want to connect to it. So I'm going to double click on this icon. And it now comes up with this little window. It keeps jumping up on my other screen, so I have to drag it over here. And if you recall, our username is Pi. Case is not important with username. Password, however, it's important. And I did change my password. So I'm simply going to say, remember the password, and I'm going to say OK. And lo and behold, there is my Raspberry Pi. Okay? So we are now talking to the Raspberry Pi through my laptop. Okay? I'm not using the keyboard or the mouse that's attached, physically attached to the Raspberry Pi, nor am I using the monitor. Okay? I'm on a different monitor altogether attached to my laptop. All right. So at this point, this is where we're at. Okay? I've got my laptop that's running my Vnc client, which we just installed. It's attached to the wireless network. And through the wireless network, it is now connected to my Raspberry Pi, which is running Vnc server. And we still have our power connected. We have our monitor, keyboard, and mouse connected. So next, what we want to do is we actually want to disconnect the monitor, keyboard, and mouse.